Welcome to the Peaked podcast, where I talk about gender identity ideology and other bad ideas, women's rights, and free speech from a European point of view. Laoise de Brún, how's it going? How do foreigners deal with your name? What do they call you?
To be honest, names that is easy to say, Laoise de Brún. It's pretty straightforward. It's more if they see the spelling on my first name and it throws them because it's all the vowels, right? But then I sometimes say to Americans, for example, oh, you've heard of Saoirse Rowan. And then they go, yeah, if they have. I mean, if they haven't, it's obviously pointless.
It's the same sound group of vowels, isn't it?
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously if you start glazing over, they glaze over when you say it's AOI, but the I has a secret fodder and that makes it an E sound and that's dominant. And then you've lost them.
But what do they say if they have not had the instructions? What do they say when they see your name written down? What do you get? Laoise? I can't even imagine what a non-Irish speaker would see it as.
So famously, once I was in Jersey a few years back in an Uber, and the Uber recorded voice kept saying Laoise, picking up Laoise. That's definitely the worst version of my name. Louise is probably the least offensive.
They just think it's a typo for Louise, probably. Yeah. I get Rosen here. And when I'm online with British people, they'll call me Róisín, but they put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Oh, yeah, I guess. Did you notice that?
Well, I have noticed when I first moved to London 20 years ago that Heathrow and Londoners say Heathrow.
Oh, Heathrow. I never heard of such thing.
So that would make sense why they're saying Róisín, because in English, not Hiberno English, which is what we speak, if there's a choice of emphasis, it'll be on the second vowel.
Right. And you sometimes go over to France, or you go over to France a lot. Have you noticed what they do with their syllable emphasis? Have you copped this?
Probably not, because I'm not, couramment like you are. But no,
Well, take that word then. Where is the emphasis? Couramment. Couramment. Am I saying it right in time? Sorry?
First syllable?
No, all of them.
Oh, yes.
Mais là, je vois que il y a de la. It's like every single syllable gets the same emphasis.
That just speaks to me of the precision of French people. It has to be comme ça. It's just how they are, isn't it?
I mean, that's what I want to talk about. I wonder, is it something to do with culture? Because have you heard this other thing that Germanic languages that put the verb at the end that contributes, or it's either a demonstration of how well organized they are, that they need to know how their sentence is going to end when they begin it, or that they became so because they had to know the end of their sentence before they began it. It made them like that. Like, this is just fascinating, isn't it?
Oh, I love that.
Isn't it insane? It's hardly a coincidence that the most organized people known with stereotypically organized culture in the world know how their sentences are going to end before they even start them.
However, how do you explain Irish people who are famously loose in that regard, very unlike the more Teutonic? Well, call me Shinny I have to do that.
Would you say, yeah, I don't know. I mean, is it always? It's something maybe we should keep an eye out for.
Typically, you're right. Typically, our verbs would always be in the front. Of course, they would be. Yeah, that's just a random example. No, you're right. So basically, Northern Europeans or those languages, Germanic languages, they are so organized that they know exactly what's happening before they even have a verb.
Yeah. I only know really for German and Dutch, which are very, very similar. You would say, ich ga eten. I'm going to go and have carbonade to eat. Well, that's a bad example, actually. Well, I don't know. Maybe some linguists can comment on that. But it is what I wanted to talk to you about today, because you just talked recently to Stella from GenSpecs on Stella's podcast, and I heard that you went through all your personal story and you went through the founding of the Countess and all of that stuff. So I'm going to just link to that for everyone who wants to get background, because I think you've been around for long enough now that we don't need to be doing intros to the Countess. We can move on. We can assume everyone sort of knows who you are. Or do you think so? Or are you still being introduced on the scene? I mean, I guess my audience is half Americans and the rest are British and Irish and Europeans. Are you still new?
It depends very much on the audience, but I think that your listeners typically will be aware that there are both gender critical / feminist grassroots groups springing up now with regard to immigration, like all over Europe. And the Countess is one of them. And I founded the Countess in 2020, and we're just kind of constantly evolving.
How are you perceived by normies in Ireland? This is what I would love to know. It's impossible to know, isn't it? I guess how
it's
people really feel about it. Like, because when you first came on the scene, I think activism in Ireland was much more visible and present, trans side and all amnesty and everything. And they just sort of demonized you and us very effectively. But I don't think that sticks anymore.
So what happened was they put out a letter demanding the politicians essentially disenfranchised us. So what they said was that do not give these people political or media representation. And actually, even though it was a kind of crazed overreach, it did work. I mean, to this day, I think we are still blacklisted effectively in RTE and also probably in the Irish Times to a degree. I mean, the fact that we occasionally break through and get quoted, like I was quoted in the ICCL piece, which I'm sure you've talked to, is spoken of to death now, and everyone's kind of...
I haven't talked about it on my podcast.
Okay,
at all.
There was a trans guide for schools put out by a very well-funded, formerly quite august NGO in Ireland. And it was exactly what Stonewall have been doing in England for many, many years, which was, it was effectively an aspirational trans lobby group wish list of what they wish the law would be. And we immediately reacted. And in fact, funnily enough, we were just signing off on the copy editing of our own guides, which you can imagine say completely different things because ours are based on the actual law. So they're kind of legally sound. But the funny thing was, it was a good case study of how Ireland works because the political editor of the Irish Times just put out the piece as if it was the law, because the way he did it was he just did a cut and paste of, I guess, their press release. And then he was kind of chippy about it and sort of said, oh, I'll let you fight it amongst yourselves or whatever.
That was insane. Yeah.
Paraphrasing. And he said, I'm not taking either side. And I kind of went into his reply saying, but it's not your job to advocate for either side. It's your job to report the news and offer context. And you haven't done that because it's very misleading the way you framed this. It's framed as, because the way they had worded it, it said it was mandatory, that the schools must do this, schools must do that, for example, use preferred pronouns. And so it was incredibly misleading. It seemed as if this was perhaps had some statutorily, status. And it wasn't. It was mean.
The verb that was used in it was might or may, schools may face legal... Well, no, but when it talked about legal repercussions, there was a very hedgy sentence, which to a normal person would have read like, oh God, I have to do this or I'm going to be breaking the law. And it was something like schools may be found in breach of a law or something if they don't do this. What was that sentence? Whatever it was, it gave the impression. And I understood that, having spent a long time following Sex Matters in the UK or whatever and things that they're doing, you understand that to mean, and I suppose because you're a lawyer, you understand as well that, you have to look at what does the sentence actually say. And the sentence basically was informing people that, like, somebody could take you to court and you'd have to argue about it and then you might lose, but probably not. You'd probably get a 4 Women Scotland type of thing. This is what this is the reality, is that, okay, somebody could accuse you of harassment, but anyone can accuse you of anything at any point. Isn't that what it sort of that's the reality. If you don't use preferred pronouns.
I felt it was a really deeply cynical exercise in ramping up the climate of fear that is already there after all, because Enoch Burke is in and out of prison in Ireland. For your listeners, Enoch Burke is an evangelical Christian teacher who refused to use preferred pronouns for a young person in the school that they taught at. There was an altercation with the headmistress. Whether or not he should have been immediately suspended on full pay has never really been tested in court, but because he has broken various court orders and injunctions that the school got against him to not go back to the school by going back to the school, even though they had a court order, because of that, he's been found in contempt of court on numerous occasions, and he spent many, many, many weeks, months in one of the most notorious prisons in Ireland, Mountjoy. So this is rumbling on now for years. And that is the backdrop, I feel, to the ICCL guidance.
I hadn't even thought of that, actually. I hadn't really linked the two. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I found it deeply cynical. I thought that these, kids, young people on huge salaries, funded by the taxpayer and international philanthropists, here they are sitting around in their nice office, Burke is in and out of Mountjoy, out of a cell, and they're thinking, how do we make hay and create more fear in staff rooms by literally fabricating what the law is. I mean, there is no obligation on schools to socially transition a child, and we would argue strongly that in light of the Cass Review, that it is really, you could totally flip it over and say that in fact, schools are leaving themselves open to liability if they do socially transition a child. And to be very, very clear, I would go further and say that if an adolescent boy in an Irish school today is allowed to use the girls' changing room, and the girls therefore lose their single-sex space, either toilet or changing room, or in fact, indeed, let's say, a place on their sports team to a boy, that girl, that female student, she would have grounds for a claim of direct discrimination.
She'd have a case, yeah.
Absolutely she would. She'd have grounds, yeah.
Just going back a bit there. So we talked about, the Irish Times covered this story. They just basically repeated what these bunch of NGOs said. So to just give an extra bit of context, the ICCL is the Civil Liberties. The others were TENI, the Transgender NGO. And what was the other one? Were there a whole bunch of the Rainbow NGOs, or was it just a...
No, it was like when it imploded. Because essentially what happened was, I'll give a brief outline of the timeline. So it's printed on the front page of the Irish Times. The Irish Times is the Irish newspaper of record. So it's given, the most kind of auspicious placing in the paper. And the way it's framed, the way it's reported is as if it is mandatory and has some kind of, it's a circular at the very least, or has some kind of status in a statutory level, when it doesn't at all. And then there's an uproar online. There's a follow-up piece done by the political editor, Pat Leahy, and he picks up the phone and does what journalists should do and stands up the story. It's called standing up the story, where you go and you say, did you write this? What does it mean? And then you get responses or reactions from everyone involved. Now, so then that's the proper treatment of the story. And it was a real example to me of like, gosh, if trans was treated as a normal story by journalists, it would be over by now. Because it just kind of shatters into a million pieces, just fractures. Because he speaks to ICCL. They double down, but they point the finger to the legal advice they got from A&L Goodbody, which is one of the top 3 law firms in Ireland, one of the most prestigious. I think it's the oldest perhaps. These are really serious people. They go to A&L Goodbody for a comment, and A&L Goodbody's name is on this document. So we don't know, was it a senior partner who signed off on this legal review? Was it a summer work experience person? We don't know. But A&L Goodbody, this law firm, will not comment. They refused to.
But hold on, sorry, Laoise, they reviewed the document itself, or they were in touch with the Irish Times? They really?
No, their name is on the document. It says they reviewed it legally. I think it was their pro bono arm. But the point is they're prepared to put the name to it. And I guess this was a little while back, because once, you really got a distinct impression of kind of rats, and a sinking ship, really. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with it. So they won't comment. Then he doesn't go to IREC. And IREC, I think this is an important part of the story. IREC is the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. And they actually do have a statute-based responsibility. Mm-hmm. They are banned by statute, and their job is to monitor and implement essentially equality laws in Ireland and human rights, monitor human rights. But like our equality laws all come from Europe, as you will know. So they've got a very kind of set in stone role, and it's statute based. But I have noticed recently that they're also experiencing the old mission creep, because their mission statement has changed over the last few years.
Incorporating all the causes.
Just being much more like, we're here to kind of help the minorities. And that's actually not what they are there to do. They're meant to be looking after human rights, equality for all citizens. It's not meant to be special people.
Specifically tied to legislation, equality legislation that exists.
Yeah, Equal Status
Right.
Act. Yes.
Because that's what, on the level above that in Europe, there's this thing called Equinet, and they're equality bodies. And every country in Europe has an equality body, and IREC is our one. In Belgium has like two. Some countries might have more than one. They're all quangos, and they all have these statutory, like that's part of some legislation somewhere, I guess, in one of the equality legislations that directives that comes from Europe says you have to set up a statutory body whose responsibility is.
Yes.
So they're all in rooms together in Brussels on a regular basis as well. So they're taking their instructions very much from Brussels. And so I would imagine it's the same mission creep all over the place. Well, definitely in Belgium. Belgium's really fucked. But yeah, so they have some sort of responsibility. And then they come out, and you're saying that they surprised you more, their involvement.
Well, yes, because they funded it. And I guess they had an oversight of it. And they're not supposed to just be a lobby group. They are statute-based. They're founded by statute. They have a statutory role. So that surprised me didn't go back to them for a comment, because I think that's where I would be digging next. In a body, yeah, that was kind of...
But just to play devil's advocate for Pat Leahy, who's the editor of the Irish Times, who put the story on the front page, etc., and who didn't get any context. You said as a journalist, your job is to report the news. Is not to take a side. So, I mean, it comes down to, this is maybe getting too philosophical, but they're supposed to think there are no two sides to this. Look, these bunch of organizations who work on this very specific domain have put out some guidance. Asking for context, like this happens all over the place all the time now, but even pretending there's an opposition to it is almost, acknowledging that there's opposition is seen as taking a side, you could say. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, but the default is taking a side. But therefore, the corollary, which is the default position, is the pro-trans side. Like my point to him online, and to him, if I was to bump into him, or to any journalist in Ireland, would be like, you must surely know that the whole premise of this guide is being litigated all over the world. Bearing in mind, this was in the 10 days after I said Sandy Peggy was the first nurse in Scotland, but basically there have been 3 different victories on behalf of nurses who were initially reprimanded, disciplined, suspended by various hospitals or NHS trusts. All of these came to court. These women went through extraordinarily stressful times. They were not typically supported by their unions, and they've all won. Like at the same time, we've just had, not very long ago, last April, an apex decision in our neighbouring jurisdiction, which was the UK Supreme Court decision, which it's an 88-page judgment. It looks at all of the European case law. It trawls through it all. It's an exhaustive trawl through. And it essentially decided that the gender recognition certificate or gender self-ID does not enable you to use opposite sex as single-sex spaces. So what it was doing was, the question it was asked, those justices were asked, was how far does trans rights extend to, and do they encroach onto so-called women's rights, or those exemptions in the Equal Status Act or the Equality Act in the UK. So, and then at the same time also, you have Title IX coming before the US Supreme Court, which is the exemptions, the lawful exemptions, again, in terms of anti-discrimination law. This is all the same legal framework, okay? That's what you have to...
It's all going on at the same time that Irish Times put this on the front page.
So if you zoom back out a little bit, we're talking about the same law all over the world. Whether that is the laws that allow for discrimination on the basis of sport, which enables us to have the category of sex in sport, enables us to have, therefore, female sport in America. That's before the US Supreme Court currently. You've just had the UK Supreme Court give a decision, and then you've got 3 tribunals whereby those nurses all...
Right, so you're saying this is the sea that an editor of a Western country is swimming in when he decides to put on the front page this gullible sort of, hear no evil, see no evil. Oh, look at this, just dropped. It's guidance. Voila, and then walks away from it like as if it's not a hugely contested issue. So that's sort of the atmosphere. But I don't think that's... You're just saying, does he not know? The answer is yes, of course he does know. There's no way in the world he doesn't know. So let's just get rid of that possibility. But I suspect that on the Slack group or the Teams group of the Irish Times, there was an emails and WhatsApp. I'd say there was a massive fight about putting a contextual paragraph in there, because I know journalists who work in lefty type newspapers in Europe, and this has been a constant battle for a while now. And I almost felt like, I don't think this is a theory that, like, you know, people are getting really, really tired of this contentious newsroom issue, and we sort of see the writing on the wall. And I almost felt like it was a cry for help. He knew what the reaction was going to be. They've all left Twitter. Everyone's left Twitter because of the reaction to the minute you go anywhere near tiptoe near this issue. There's just so explosive. He knew what was going to happen. And the fact that, Leisha, he didn't put it on the front page. He put it in the middle of the front page. It was like right in the center. So do you think that they, like, we all have our theories, I guess. I would like to hear yours, because, you know, like, you get rid of that notion straight away that he doesn't know about Supreme Court, Title IX, all that stuff. I mean, Irish people, Irish editors are obsessed with what goes on in the UK and in America.
What is true, but there was this weird myopic vision of, you know, oh, that's just all the trans stuff. That's toxic. That's a bit Trump. And, you know, initially in the early days of activism, it was, oh, that's the Brexiteers, that's the Tories. There's a real increasingly desperate need to kind of conceptualize it as, you know, far right, right wing. I mean, it's all nonsense, obviously, but I think they're still so desperately cleaving to the idea that, you know, to be pro-trans is to be a good person. I'm a good person, you know.
Well, that brings you back to then you being featured on mainstream news in Ireland. So I know you've been on Tucker and stuff in the US, but let's just stick to Ireland for now. That's it. Inviting you on a show then, inviting you to have a comment, is sort of like saying, we've invited somebody from the far right today to come and, like, you know, so that's, you either, are they putting you still in that box? Are they still, you know, there was a big effort to associate you and your organization, the Countess, with the far right. I mean, also initially, which was really funny, Mother England trying to claim that gender critical thinking is just an import from the British colonial masters, which is just really funny. There was a lot of this like demonizing. And so, I mean, it must be really difficult for them to, I mean, they have no one that hasn't been demonized as far right to speak on this issue. Like Colette Colfer, who we both know, is sort of seen as she's more neutral than the Countess, I would say, as a, I've heard somebody call this in the UK before, call a cunt, sorry for my language, but it's like when you need somebody to give the opposite view, like, you know, they need somebody who's to give the opposite view. There's Colette Colfer. They'd never go to Enoch Burke's family because they're absolutely written off 100%. Like, everyone has sort of been demonized. There is nobody who's neutral to speak on this topic. Like Helen Joyce was once invited on Irish media, was she? Or a couple of times? And the first time I remember was like a Tipperary radio show or something. You know, like, who can they ask they haven't demonized as a far-right extremist?
I wouldn't really overstate that. Like, I think that more and more people are not watching RTÉ, more and more people are not getting their news from Irish Times. I mean, the demographics are kind of as they are all over the world. You're talking about the over 60s, really, firstly. Secondly, people are increasingly getting their news from YouTube. We've always had a very strong social media game. I'm a former broadcast journalist. So one of my first things I did when I set up the Countess was set up like 5 different channels. And we pump out all our content across those channels. So people find us in that way. Like, so we've kind of gone past the middleman. Do you know what I mean? So I just don't legitimize how they very, very tightly manage the Overton window. Because frankly, the gatekeepers are losing their grip of the narrative increasingly in Ireland and elsewhere. Like, firstly. Secondly, Ireland doesn't have to be Dublin, doesn't have to be Dublin-centric. And I'm not from Dublin, I'm from a farm in County Carlow. So I've always naturally kind of lent that way. So also one of the first things we did when I founded the Countess was look up every single radio station in Ireland and our media list. You know, when we do a campaign, it goes out to every single station. So we've always had a lot of interviews, you know, in the local radio stations. Some of them are regional. And the thing is about those, it's a very powerful lever to pull in Ireland because Ireland is very local in the way it operates as a community. And the people who are listening to regional radio in Ireland are far more likely to phone their TD than someone listening to national.
They're likely to know their TD, which is an MP.
As well, in the constituency. We've used that in the past in terms of getting things to bubble up to a parliamentary party level and getting them in, getting our matters into that for discussion at parliamentary party meetings. And then I think also thirdly, sooner or later they do sort of buckle. So now I will routinely go and do news talk being one of the more notable agenda setting outlets who are prepared to really...
They're less woke, aren't they? They're a bit more normal.
Go there. They'll just walk in and they will cover these stories which are seen as a bit more trigger hair. I mean, like RT essentially is there to amplify the government narrative. And not only that, I would go further and say to prepare the ground for government policy. That's kind of how it sees its job. I mean, I sometimes think it's hilarious when you hear RT reports, or even sometimes the Irish Times podcast, which I do listen to. I mean, I listen to the whole spectrum. I think we all should do that. But like the Irish Times podcast, they'll say sometimes like, well, no, the minister will be thinking. And the minister will and you're like, oh, is this journalism? That's not journalism. That's just like a courtier bringing someone's ear who's come from court. That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
So they all have their own roles. And I think you have to be kind of wise to it.
Yeah, when you go on Newstalk, or Sandra Adams also, who's also with the Countess still, I guess, she's brilliant as well. When you guys go on these shows or when you give a quote or whatever, is there backlash now saying, you shouldn't be quoting those people? Or I'm trying to suss out, like, because I feel like the activist base is shrinking in Ireland a bit as well. Like, I feel like they're not as vocal.
We don't get any backlash anymore. And a good marker for that for me was I ran for the Senate last year. And this time last year, in fact, would have been this time last year. And my team who coalesced around me, like they included kind of former, like civil servants, high-ranking civil servants from Department of Foreign Affairs was one guy. There was a few lawyers, there was a few bankers, there was a few multimedia kind of graphics gurus, whizzes. And it's very organic, the process of a team coming around you when you run for office. And initially, the huge problem or the thing that we faced from the outset was, how are we going to deal with the backlash? Mm-hmm. Huge amount of time and effort was put into kind of wargaming that, and how we would offset it. And if it went this way, we would say this. And if it went that way, there wasn't a peep. There wasn't a peep.
Seriously?
Yeah. So that was very... Yeah.
You know what it is as well, though? I think it's because to draw attention to you would be to draw attention to your issue. And that's kind of the thing that dooms... I mean, not that you're only a single issue, but the issue that you became known for, which is the trans stuff. The more they point their fingers at you, the more they say, hey, look over here. Here's a fash, whatever it is. Here's somebody from, importing these British ideas into Ireland, whatever, the more they draw people's attention to you and the Countess and TERFs and stuff, the more people get piqued. So they're kind of stuck, aren't they? In that way. Like, I find that it's kind of a curse on their movement, because attention it's like ignorance is the key to their success. And, having someone like you standing for Senate, the best thing for them is to just not draw attention to you at all.
Yeah, I think so. I also think we just bored them. We had a very, very strict online policy from the beginning that I instilled. Some people didn't like it and they left.
Which was what? What was it?
Just we never ever go after personalities. We never get into spats. We never ever make it personal. We barely even tag people online. And we only talk about policy and practice. And I will always bring it back to that. Frankly, the balls get really bored. The flying monkeys get really bored. It takes a lot of discipline to behave like that, but we're here to impact policy. If you're spending all your time arguing with the flying monkeys, then they're doing their job, which is to take you away from your mission.
Mm-hmm. And actually, I said that what you're known for, but you have an entire life that you lived before you became sort of a campaigner for women's rights. You were political already-ish. Am I right? It's not like you had to invent opinions on all policy areas from scratch. No,
I was always very, very political. I was always a feminist and hugely political. But and politicized. So yeah, I had very thoughtful, considered opinions, but they're always evolving. I mean, I would have been pro-trans initially before I understood what it really meant, before I joined the dots. So
and you're quite left-wing in Irish terms anyway, like about nationalism and Northern Ireland and all that stuff. Maybe we shouldn't go into that. But I've noticed that your politics would have been traditionally more like Sinn Féin side, but now those people are lost to us.
yeah, I always say I'm an old lefty. And I mean, what I mean by that is women's rights and child protection and end all wars and gay rights and pro-choice. But now all those positions are very highly nuanced for me, and pro-Europe. And equally, I'm always considering my position. And sometimes that's not popular. People really, really want you to pick a tribe and just stick to your bloody tribe. But I really don't believe in that. I try to take every issue, take it issue by issue, and do as much reading as possible and thinking as possible, and think critically, and then decide. Having said that, I do think that on the trigger her issues, be it Palestine, be it abortion, trans, obviously immigration, and even Ukraine, you pretty much land on one side of what is effectively a conflict of rights situation. And you land on the side that your empathy has been triggered by. And the matter of your empathy being triggered is really to do with everything you've ever been through, how you are wired, how your psyche works, how your life experiences have coalesced to bring you to that position. And it's kind of where you land, and you can't really dislodge it with facts, I find. And I'm always reminded of that when I try to persuade someone and do advocacy. Is like, the reason that trans is embedded so much is because of the emotional argument that took hold. The sympathy vote, the most vulnerable, the minority in the world who need us, who need our protection. And people who are still cleaving to that emotional position of empathy, they don't really want the facts. They don't want the facts. They don't care about the facts. And I've noticed that about all these issues. Maybe that's different. I will always hunger for facts, and I will always not enjoy changing my mind. I have that kind of flexibility, I suppose.
I think some people have those brains where the novelty of a new information that changes, that sort of more and more nuance, pile it on, and it sort of like tickles their brains. But, there are issues that, somebody will say, why don't you care about this other issue? And I just don't care about it. There's a lot of people who just don't care about the trans issue. And in a way, those are the most frustrating people. Because it's not that their sentimentality has been weaponized or whatever. It's just that they're just like, oh yeah, well, why don't you care about climate change? It's like, well, I just don't fucking care about it. Like, I just don't feel, my brain isn't drawn to it, and those people are very frustrating. But I agree with you 100% that people aren't going on facts at all. That's true. And I think women have an issue with this. There's a lot of discussion on Twitter these days about like why women, these days, there's been for ages, why women go along with the trans stuff so much. And I truly do believe that women are sort of enforcers of norms, because evolutionarily speaking, it's the safest thing to be, is to be consensus, to go along with the consensus and help everyone keep in line with the consensus, because that's the safest space to be. It's the safest place for a cave woman to be, is to be agreeing with everyone around her and being like, oh yeah. And then sort of keeping everyone in line with the status quo. Maybe you don't get many rogue cave women. Like, it's very unsafe for us to go out on our own. But even men, a lot of men I know do this as well. It's like, they're absolutely horrified that you go against the grain. They're absolutely horrified. I think for a lot of people, it's not even necessarily, first of all, it's not about critical thinking. They haven't done the critical thinking. They've outsourced that to the tribe. Fine. And we'll go along with that. And then the other thing is just that they don't want to be associated with this thing that's considered mean. And it's never about first principles. It's never about going back and saying, right, well, what's the outcome if we put F on the passport that should be M? They're not thinking about it that way. As you say, like, completely resistant to facts. But we know this is a very particular issue, I think, the trans issue, because we know that, like, as soon as they know about it, everyone will be on our side. They just can't say it. So is that changing in Ireland right now? I've always been convinced that, it's the large silent majority that they're on our side. They just can't say it for reasons that we just outlined. What do you think is happening in Ireland at the moment?
I think it is very much depends on class, actually. I've noticed that with trans and then more recently with my work around immigration, that the more highly educated you are in Ireland, the more likely you are to not only hold luxury beliefs, but identify as someone who believes X or Y. Identify with, I am the sort of person who is pro-trans rights. I am the sort of person who is pro-immigration, because that makes me a good person, a compassionate person, a lefty. And so it's very identitarian. And so I used to think that kind of, Middle Ireland agreed with our positions, and I still think that's true. I suppose I've realized that, especially when it comes to immigration, that there's a huge swathe of people for whom it doesn't impact their day-to-day lives.
And they're also, I want to be the kind of person who is open to immigration and I don't want to be seen as a kind of person who's called a racist or called a whatever it is critics of immigration are called.
Look, for me, those same people, it's no coincidence that those people who would have been, let's say, the nascent middle class, Irish Indigenous middle class in the sort of 40s, 50s, 60s, who would have been the upholders of the ultra strict version, the brand of Catholicism, which was utilised in Ireland to create extraordinarily strict social control. Like, people seem to think that Ireland was very Catholic, and because Ireland was very Catholic, we were locking up girls not only who got pregnant out of wedlock, but even if the local priest spotted you, messing around with a guy or on your own without a chaperone with a guy, you would end up in one of the various system of homes. Like in the 50s, Ireland was incarcerating more of its population per capita than the USSR was. And that is how we operated as a society. But people like to think it was the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church wasn't an occupying army. No one went to the homes of these families and put a gun to the head of the mother or father and said, give us your daughter. I mean, there's one story I read recently whereby a local pharmacist developed pictures of some boys and girls messing around on a boat in the local harbour. That's all they were doing. Just the boys were rowing the boat, the girls were laughing. The photos were developed by the pharmacist, and he went to the father of one of the girls in the photos and said, you have to do something about this. The dad didn't want to do anything. Then he went to the priest. This is the pharmacist. He went to the priest. The priest said, oh, right. And seemingly reluctantly went to the dad. And then the daughter was incarcerated in one of these systems of homes. Sometimes it was an asylum. Sometimes it was a Madeleine laundry, a mother and baby home if you were pregnant. So my point being is that people think that came directly from the church. None of these were edicts from the Vatican. This was a particular brand of Irish social control. I believe that the Catholic Church was just a useful mechanism or framework, but it was Irish.
It was enforced by people. It's lacking.
And it was a way, and I think also post-famine, it was a way to protect the nascent, burgeoning working landowner class. Because for the first time, Irish people had farms. If you own land, you have to make sure who's going to inherit the land. Therefore, you couldn't have illegitimacy anymore. Because at that time, it would have been pretty typical to have children out of wedlock, certainly in the west of Ireland, and places that were sort of unblemished or unimpacted by, say, more English culture. There's a famous story of some early archivists after independence, not long after independence, they go to the west of Ireland to record the Irish language spoken by native speakers. And they just go around doing essentially ethnographic interviews. And they interview a couple, and they're horrified to find that the woman is talking about the different studs in the village and people are babies left, right and centre. And there's a real bawdy sense around sex, sexuality.
Sorry to interrupt. You're making me think of that song. She's like, I wish I was his wife and I wish I was going on a boat with him to Galway. Sorry to interrupt.
But like that. All peasants, say Schuster was the same. I mean, there was a kind of a realism about sex and a kind of earthiness to peasant life across Europe. But that didn't sit well with this vision we had of ourselves of a new country that was respectable and, clean living and highly Christian and very Catholic. And so that's the reason, for example, that Peg Sayers, the famous historical text, is so boring, because they edited out all references to sex.
I've never thought about any of this at all, but because I would have thought like, if you take the Vatican, I always sort of thought like Ireland was being the best Catholic for the Vatican and getting, impressing the Vatican and doing the best version of Catholicism and the strictest, and the harshest, in the same way that we're now doing for like institutions like the Council of Europe and the European Commission. We're saying like, well, yes, sir. Like, fucking how high do you want me to jump? Like, maybe not at all, you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you like delve into it, there was a sense that, yes, for sure, we want to be the best Catholics in the world. Obviously, you and I will remember a time, we would have grown up in a time where there was universal mass attendance up until the late 90s.
Of course, yeah.
Now it's back to about 50%, which is surprisingly, or funnily enough, that's exactly the attendance rate we had before the famine. So you can look at really Catholicism in Ireland.
No way.
And after the famine. So, for example, before the famine, a lot of the sacraments would have happened out in the fields or around the kitchen table. And it was after the famine. And Derek Scally talks about this in his amazing book, which I highly recommend, The Best Catholics in the World.
He really cool.
He talks about how there was essentially a power grab, and the church becomes an institution, and they start to manage this flock, and this, Irish people are essentially massively traumatized after the famine, where 1 million people have died of hunger, 1 million people have emigrated in the immediate aftermath. And this is a hugely traumatized population, and the church essentially see their chance, and they institutionalize. But then we have this extremely strict version of Catholicism in Ireland, and it's essentially it's premised on respectability. Respectability was a very Victorian concept that lasted much longer in Ireland than it did in Victorian England. It kind of left England with Victoria, with that reign. But in Ireland, it remained. And the idea was, and that was, I think, what predicated and was the kind of driving factor behind the locking up of women. The idea that the honour of the whole of the household was embedded in the purity of the women of that household. That was all about being respectable and being seen to be respectable. And the way we practice our Catholicism, it wasn't in with any sort of great deal of curiosity theologically. It was very much about being seen to be devout. So, for example, the well-to-do families in each village and town in Ireland, they would get the front seat based on their donations. So I think that is what's happening today. To me, there's a direct line from that era of, the respectable people telling the rest of them, looking down on the rest of them, to this sense today that, the journalist class, the academy, the lawyers, the bankers, there's a lot of people who would be seen to be, in that class, who have, I think, unconsciously decided where the new locus of power is, and it is definitely radical progressivism in Ireland, isn't it?
The respectability is linked to progressivism as opposed to linked to chastity or chasteness or whatever it is. And just as you were describing it, it's really similar to Muslim families, Muslim culture that I know in Brussels. So as you know, I live in Brussels. I'm surrounded by Muslim families. Like 80% of my street is Muslim families. And it's the same kind of thing. The older people, and this is a conversation that's going on everywhere at the moment, but the people who are like 45 and above, parents, are very chill about everything. And it's the younger ones who are sort of getting back into the old ways of and being very chaste and very respectable. And, the hair, there's more veils and stuff, there's a lot of like policing each other's respectability, honor, all that stuff. All that stuff is sort of coming back. I think everywhere in Europe, there's a little bit of that creeping back in, but it's very much about, the honor of the entire family is tied up in what the daughter wears, like, and where the daughter goes. And it's all about what everyone thinks about the daughter. The wife, who cares, because she's inside, she's diabetic, she's completely overweight, she's completely covered when she goes outside anyway. Forget her. It's the daughter. Everything is tied up in the honor of the daughter. It's just mirrors sort of what I understand of very devout Ireland back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, because by the time we were kids, it loosened its grip, and it was, gone by the time I was 17, I would say. I was still going to mass in the 90s. Everyone was sort of letting go of it in the 90s. But by the time I was 17, what was that? 2000, it was gone. I don't know.
You know what? I have a 15-year-old now, and funny thing is, like, she's got a leap card and she goes all around Dublin, and she'll say, you know, oh, we decided to go to Liffey Valley or whatever some Saturday, and off she'll go. And I'm so relaxed. She just happens to be very responsible, together young girl as well. But it's funny how I had a memory recently of when I was that age, there was this whole thing about you couldn't go down the town, you know, if like, because you'd be seen, or it was seen as, like, it was never spelled out, but it was like kind of tacky or cheap or trashy to be wandering the streets as a girl, as a teenage girl, with your mates or on
In
your own.
Carlow Town.
Yeah, but in general, that was kind of the thing. Yeah. And I think that was probably the last residue of
Maybe.
that.
Because you're a couple of years older than me, are you?
Yeah.
You don't have to talk about our ages.
Yeah. Would have been, let's put it this way, this would have been mid-90s.
Right. Well, I didn't have that experience because I was in Dublin in a housing estate, and it was different. You go into Dublin City like you're anonymous. Nobody knows who anyone is. So it didn't really matter. Yeah, that's an interesting history of Ireland that I just never really think about. I interviewed a friend recently called Susie about Belgian culture because something happened recently in Belgium that I was really upset about, and this episode's going to be coming out next week or something, so you can hear all about it. But Belgium has a man, a transvestite, trans woman who is a very high-profile public figure. And he recently got caught in a cheating scandal. And so he's been pressured to step down from his very prestigious job as the dean of a big university. And nobody's talking about the fact that he's pretended to be a woman for the last 15 years. And it's just very, very weird. And when the story first broke, I was like, come on, somebody mentioned the fact that he's also lying about being female. And he's taken the deputy prime minister job in the past. He's also been a member of the European Parliament. He's been a senior figure in the Green Party for a long time. He takes women's spots, quota jobs, he's been doing all this for years. And it was horrific because when the story, I can see you shaking your head there. When the story first broke, I was like, right, I'm going to say nothing. I'm going to give it a few days to see, will people come around naturally to the realization that, that was the first part of the conversation. If you would like to hear the rest, you can go to peaked.substack.com to hear more. You do that by taking out a paid subscription, which helps me to continue this work and to quit my day job so I can do more of it. Thank you very much. Peaked.substack.com.